Am I the a hole for lying to my partner about having kids and laughing about it? So I recently became engaged to my 34F partner, 35M. We met on a dating app 3 years ago and hit it off from the start. From our very first dinner, things felt effortless. We shared the same sense of humor, the same outlook on career growth, and a mutual love for quiet nights in. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to really value the fact that I was an independent woman with my own life and ambitions. Over those 3 years, we built what I thought was a solid foundation. We navigated career changes, moved into a beautiful apartment together, and eventually started discussing a permanent future. 5 years ago, I got my fallopian tubes removed. This wasn't a snap decision or something I did on a whim. I've known I don't want to give birth since I was 15 years old and have never changed my mind. It was a deeply personal choice made after years of reflection, and honestly, the relief I felt after the procedure was immense. I've always been maternal in other ways. I'm the cool aunt to my friends' kids, and I'm devoted to my dog, but the physical act of pregnancy and the lifelong commitment of raising biological children was never part of my blueprint. I always said that if a child came into my life, like through marriage or adoption later down the line if the circumstances were right, I'd love it, but I'm not actively seeking that out. Because this is such a major deal breaker for most people, I made sure to be as transparent as possible when I entered the dating scene. On my dating profile, it explicitly states child-free and infertile verbatim. It wasn't buried at the bottom, it was right there in the bio section. I wanted to filter out anyone who had their heart set on a white picket fence life with biological kids. I didn't want to waste anyone's time, and I didn't want mine wasted either. At the beginning of our relationship, my now fiancé regularly referenced other things I put in my profile. He'd bring up my favorite books I'd listed, or the fact that I mentioned I love spicy food. Because he clearly read the rest of it, I had assumed he'd read that part too. Consequently, the topic of kids never really came up in our conversations in a serious way. We were focused on building our careers, traveling, and moving in together. I thought we were on the same page. I thought the child-free label on my profile was the silent foundation of our relationship. When we talked about the future, we talked about travel, retirement, and the house we wanted to buy, none of which included a nursery. Everything changed last night. We were celebrating our engagement, having a quiet evening at home with a bottle of wine, talking about the future.
It was supposed to be a romantic night.
Out of nowhere, he mentioned that I should consider stopping my birth control since now we're engaged, and given our ages, we should start trying for kids soon. I was caught completely off guard. I honestly thought he was joking. I thought it was some kind of dry humor about how old we were getting or a jab at the traditional expectations people have for engaged couples. So I laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, it was a good one, babe, kind of chuckle. I thought he was playing into a stereotype. His face didn't change. In fact, he got frustrated. He set his glass down on the coffee table with a thud and asked me why I thought it was funny. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The warmth in the room evaporated. I realized then that he wasn't joking. I felt a pit form in my stomach as I reminded him that the second line of my dating profile said I was ostensibly infertile. I told him, "Honey, you know I can't have kids." It was right there in my bio when we met. I've been open about this from the start. He looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. He was shocked and called me a liar. He claimed he had never seen that on my profile and that I must have added it later, or that I was making it up now to get out of having children because I was scared of commitment. He started raising his voice, saying I'd been deceptive for 3 years. He said he assumed child-free just meant I didn't have kids yet. I'm a logical person, especially when I'm under pressure. I happen to remember that I sent a screenshot of my dating profile to a friend for review around that time, back when I was first setting it up and nervous about how I was coming across. I went to my phone and pulled up the old conversation with her to show him the time and date. I held the phone out so he could see the screen. There it was, dated 3 years ago, explicitly stating that I was child-free and infertile. I told him I had my tubes taken out, so there was no chance of me getting pregnant without outside help. I explained the bilateral salpingectomy to him as calmly as I could. I mentioned that while IVF is technically still an option if someone has their tubes removed, I don't want to put my body through that. The hormonal toll, the invasive procedures, the cost, it's not something I'm willing to do for a life I never sought out in the first place. He didn't want to hear about the medical side. He didn't care about the proof. He was stuck on the word liar. He told me I should have brought it up verbally, that a dating profile isn't a legal document, and that I had stolen his choice to be a father. He told me he felt like he'd been living a lie. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the frames on the wall rattled. Within an hour, my phone started blowing up. It was like a coordinated strike. His mom called me, hysterical and crying, telling me that I've ruined his life. She kept saying that she was looking forward to being a grandmother and that I had tricked her son into a dead-end relationship. She even called me broken for having the surgery. Then his sister sent me a long, vitriolic message about how getting my tubes removed at a young age should be illegal and how I'm a monster for stringing my fiancé along. To be honest, his family never really liked me because they think I'm beneath him. It's been an uphill battle since I met them. They are very focused on appearances. A cousin actually told me at a family barbecue a few months ago that they don't think I'm a good fit because I'm fat. It's true, I'm a plus-sized woman, but I'm also pretty active. I take regular walks with my dog, I go hiking every weekend, I'm an avid biker and swimmer, I love paddleboarding in the summer, and I even do a little snowshoeing in the winter. Interestingly, none of which my fiancé does with me. He prefers the gym or staying on the couch, but because he's naturally thin, his family views him as the healthy one. They also seem intimidated by my career. I'm a woman in a high-level position within a male-dominated field. I worked incredibly hard to get where I am, putting in 60-hour weeks to earn my seat at the table. On top of that, my fiancé and I share the household labor 50-50, and I actually make significantly more money than he does. His family is very traditional, and they hate the power dynamic in our house. They think I should be more submissive or homemaking focused. They see my independence as a threat to his masculinity. Because of this, I usually don't take what they say too seriously. I've developed a thick skin over the years. I've learned to smile and nod when they make passive-aggressive comments about my weight or my job. But this time, I'm starting to feel bad. The sheer volume of their anger is overwhelming. His family believes I stole years of his life and ruined future chances of being a father by lying about my fertility status. They are framing it as a grand conspiracy on my part to trap him. They're telling him that he needs to leave me now while he still has time to find someone who can give him a real family. He asked for space when he stormed out, so I haven't reached out to him. I've been sitting in our quiet house with just my dog, replaying the last 3 years in my head. I'm looking at the engagement ring on my finger and wondering how I missed such a massive disconnect. I wonder how we never had a direct conversation about it, but then I remember that I put it in writing before we even met. I wonder why he never asked why I stayed on birth control or what my thoughts were on kids when his friends started having them. I do love him, but I'm starting to have serious second thoughts given his family's reactions and his own refusal to acknowledge the truth I had put front and center from day one. I'm realizing that he might have been projecting a version of me that didn't exist onto our relationship. I realize now that we should have talked about this before, especially before getting engaged, but am I the a-hole for how I handled the situation? Update 1. So my fiancé came home this morning and I asked him if he wanted to talk. He said there was nothing left to talk about. I asked if he wanted the ring back and he got angry. I've never seen him like this and I tried to speak calmly to him, but he was just yelling about how I was giving up and wouldn't even talk to him. I reminded him that I'd asked if he wanted to talk and he said no, to which he responded that he didn't think I'd go all crazy over a disagreement. The entire interaction fell off from the start. There wasn't any attempt to understand what had actually happened the night before, just an immediate shift into blame. He kept pacing while talking, barely letting me finish a sentence before cutting me off. It wasn't a discussion. It was him reacting to something he'd already decided was my fault. This was a huge wake-up call for me. I asked him why he'd never brought up kids beforehand, and he said because he knew I would get all weird about it. I tried to get him to clarify what weird meant, but he just kept saying he couldn't talk to me when I was like this. I never raised my voice. I stayed seated the entire time and I kept my tone even, but he kept acting like I was being irrational. At one point, he said that I was overcomplicating something that should be simple, that we were engaged now, and this is just what people do next. That statement alone made it clear that we weren't even having the same conversation. For him, this wasn't about compatibility or long-term goals. It was about following a script he assumed we were both on board with. I told him I can't have kids, nor do I want any. I don't want to give birth. That seems like a deal breaker for him and his family. He said his family had nothing to do with this, and I asked why he told them then. He said because he was hoping they'd talk sense into me. That part stuck more than anything else he said. Not just that he involved them, but that he believed I needed to be convinced out of a decision I'd been clear about for years. I told him I was ending the relationship and staying with my dad for the time being. This didn't go over well. The tone shifted immediately. The anger wasn't just about kids anymore, it was about losing control of the situation. He started saying that I was overreacting, that couples fight and move on, that I was throwing everything away over one disagreement. It wasn't one disagreement, though. It was 3 years of completely different expectations that had never actually been addressed. I'm still kind of shaking. As I was leaving, I asked him how long he's wanted kids, and he admitted he never thought about it, but he knew I didn't want any. He said that now that we were engaged, it wasn't just about me anymore, he had a say in children. The way he said it made it sound like engagement automatically meant renegotiating decisions I had already made about my own body. I told him I physically could not get pregnant without IVF and asked him how he expected that to work. He responded that I didn't know what I was talking about. That part didn't even feel worth arguing. It wasn't just dismissive, it was completely disconnected from reality. I left after that because I just didn't have the energy to try and convince him, and I didn't want to further agitate him. Getting my things together felt surreal. Nothing dramatic, just grabbing essentials and trying not to prolong being in that space. He didn't try to stop me physically, but he kept talking from across the room, alternating between frustration and disbelief, like I was making a temporary decision that I'd walk back later. When I got to my dad's place and told him everything, he was furious. Not in a loud or explosive way, but in a very controlled, direct way that made it clear he understood exactly what had happened. Apparently, when my fiancé spoke to him about proposing, my dad asked him if he was okay never having kids, as I'd had my tubes removed. My dad says he specifically brought up my surgery and the impossibility of natural pregnancy. My fiancé told my dad that it'd always be my decision. That conversation changed how I see everything that happened after. This wasn't a misunderstanding or something that got overlooked. He had been told directly, by someone else, in clear terms. He acknowledged it at the time. Then later, he chose to ignore it or assume it would change. It also explains why kids never came up in a serious way during our relationship. Looking back, there were small comments here and there about the future, vague enough that they didn't stand out at the time. Nothing that suggested he had a different expectation, just general ideas about life. It makes more sense now that he wasn't avoiding the topic because it didn't matter to him, but because he expected it to resolve itself later. I'm thankful this happened before we started any of the wedding planning, but it feels like I swallowed a boulder. Everything feels heavier than it should. Not just the breakup, but the realization that something this significant was never actually settled between us. The messages from his family didn't stop right away. Before I blocked them, there were multiple texts and a group chat that escalated quickly. It started with accusations about deception, then shifted into personal attacks. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything to gain from engaging with people who had already decided what they believed. Blocking them felt less like avoiding conflict and more like removing unnecessary noise. Logistically, there's a lot to deal with. My dad is going to help me move my stuff over the next couple of days. I've already started making a list of what needs to be sorted with the landlord. The lease situation is complicated, but manageable. I'm financially stable enough to handle most of the fees if it comes to that. I don't know how he plans to handle the rent on his own, but that's not something I can fix. I've gone through our shared accounts and subscriptions, made sure everything tied to me is either transferred or canceled. It's not emotional work, just necessary. In a way, it's easier to focus on the practical side of things because it gives some structure to everything else that feels unsettled. The only text I've received from him just said, "You'll regret this." I don't believe this is meant as a threat, but I'm being cautious just in case. I've shared the message with my dad, and I'm making sure someone knows where I am when I'm moving things back and forth. It's more about being careful than expecting something to happen. There's a strange mix of emotions right now. Relief is part of it, even if it doesn't feel like it should be. Not relief that the relationship ended, but relief that this didn't come up years later when things were more complicated. At the same time, there's a sense of loss that doesn't have a clear place to go. It's not just about him, it's about the version of the future that no longer exists. I know I need to be more adamant in the future about my stance on kids, and I will be. Not just mentioning it once and assuming it's understood, but having a direct, explicit conversation early on. This isn't something that can sit in the background and be assumed. It needs to be stated clearly, acknowledged, and revisited if necessary. I also understand now that agreement at one point doesn't mean permanent alignment. People change their minds, sometimes without even realizing it, and that requires communication that goes beyond initial assumptions. Thank you all for the feedback. It was helpful to understand where I went wrong. This was my first long-term relationship, and I fucked up a lot of the communication, but I know it's not just on me. I tend to be the kind of person that doesn't like to rehash things if I feel like we're on the same page, but with huge decisions like this, reiterating is necessary, and people are allowed to change their minds, which means rehashing is necessary in a healthy relationship. Update 2.
Hi.
So, I completely forgot about this account until recently, and figured I'd give an update since the story got both crazier and then a bit anticlimactic, and a few people have asked. I'm going to give fake names, so it's easier. Ex-fiancé is Josh. His sister will be Jill. Moving out was pretty easy. Josh wasn't around, but I did find a few of my things in odd places that I suspect was intentional to make me leave them behind. It wasn't anything huge, just enough to notice. A couple of kitchen items tucked into storage bins that weren't mine, some paperwork missing from the folder I kept it in, things like that. It slowed the process down more than anything because I had to double-check everything before I left. My dad stayed with me the whole time, which helped keep things calm and quick. The apartment felt different even though nothing had really changed. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet in a way that made it clear I didn't belong there anymore. I took what I needed, left what was clearly his, and didn't drag it out longer than necessary. By the end of the day, everything important was packed into my car, or my dad's truck, and that was it. No confrontation, no last conversation, nothing that needed to be revisited. For about a week after that, everything was quiet. No messages, no attempts to reach out, nothing from his family either. It almost felt like things were going to end in a relatively normal way, given everything that had already happened.
That didn't last.
I got called into an impromptu work meeting. My company is fairly small, and I'm in the upper level of the admin team, so it's not totally uncommon to get meetings with the two owners, who are a married couple. Usually it's about operations or scheduling, sometimes performance reviews, but nothing that had ever made me nervous before. This time felt different from the start. When I logged on, it turned out to be a coaching conversation to address my use of company resources for personal matters. That caught me completely off guard. I didn't even know what they were referring to at first. Apparently, Jill had found the company phone number and had been calling repeatedly, trying to get through to me or my supervisor. The company we use to manage incoming calls is a third-party service, so the calls never actually reached anyone internally, but they logged the attempts. From their perspective, it looked like someone was aggressively trying to contact me through business channels. Because my position isn't client-facing, my name isn't attached to that number in any way. The service couldn't even confirm who Jill was asking for, which made it more confusing on their end. It just showed up as repeated calls referencing me indirectly, escalating in tone according to the call logs. That's what triggered the meeting. I'm usually good under pressure, especially in a work setting, but that moment hit differently. There wasn't time to think about how to frame anything or decide how much to share. I ended up explaining everything, not in a polished or organized way, just the full situation as it had unfolded. It wasn't planned, but it was honest. My bosses handled it better than I expected. They asked a few clarifying questions, mostly to understand if there was any risk of the situation affecting the business further. Once it was clear that it was a personal issue that had spilled over externally, the tone of the meeting shifted completely. It turned out that both of them are intentionally child-free as well, which I hadn't known before. That didn't change anything professionally, but it did seem to help them understand the situation more directly. There wasn't any judgment about my decision, just concern about the harassment and how to address it properly. One of them, the husband, is retired Navy, and at one point he asked if he should handle it personally, which his wife immediately shut down with a look that made it clear that was not happening. From there, the conversation moved into what steps I could take to protect myself. They reassured me that my job wasn't at risk and that I hadn't done anything wrong. The focus shifted entirely to making sure the situation didn't escalate further. Long story short, I ended up finding an attorney. It wasn't something I had planned on doing, but after the calls to my workplace, it felt necessary. The attorney walked me through the process of documenting everything and helped me file for a protective order. At that point, the situation had already crossed into something more serious than just unwanted contact. Jill didn't handle this well. Instead of backing off, she escalated. Along with Josh and their mom, she attempted to sue me for damages. The claim itself didn't make much sense legally, but it still had to go through the system. That process took time. A lot more time than I expected. It took about a year before everything actually made it to court. In the meantime, there were continued attempts at contact, though less direct. Most of it was through formal channels at that point, which at least meant everything was documented. My attorney handled communication, and I didn't engage with them personally at all. When the case finally went in front of a judge, it didn't take long for things to unravel. The claims didn't hold up, and the judge was very clear about that. There was visible frustration about the misuse of court resources. The case was dismissed, as expected, but the process itself was still exhausting. On the other side of that, I was granted a restraining order against Josh, Jill, and their mom. The documentation from my workplace, along with the records of repeated contact attempts, was enough. There were also recordings from the third-party call service, but they weren't even necessary in the end. The pattern of behavior was clear without them. After that, everything stopped.
Completely.
No more calls, no more messages, no indirect contact. It was like a switch flipped once there were legal consequences attached. I blocked all of them across everything I could think of and haven't heard anything since. I don't know what they're doing now, and I don't feel the need to find out. Living with my dad ended up working out better than expected. Originally, it was supposed to be temporary just until I figured out my next step, but there wasn't any pressure to leave. He seemed genuinely happy to have me there. Looking back, I think he had been lonely and just didn't say it outright. We fell into a routine pretty quickly. Splitting bills, sharing meals when schedules lined up, nothing complicated. It wasn't a step backward like I initially worried it might feel. It was just different and a lot more stable than where I had been before. My dog adjusted immediately. She's always loved my dad, so from her perspective, it probably felt like an upgrade. More space, more attention, and someone always around. She settled in faster than I did. I haven't been dating. Not because I'm avoiding it completely, but because there's no urgency. The idea of starting something new doesn't feel appealing right now, and that's fine. Instead, I've been focusing on things I didn't have time for before. I started taking mixed martial arts classes, which has been a completely different experience than anything I've done before. It's structured, physical, and requires a level of focus that doesn't leave room for anything else while you're there. I also finished a year of ice skating classes, which started as something small and ended up being something I genuinely enjoyed sticking with. Having that time back has been one of the better parts of everything. There's space now that didn't exist before, and I'm not rushing to fill it with anything specific. Being single doesn't feel like a gap that needs to be fixed. It just feels like where I am right now. Looking back, there were things about Josh and his family that I overlooked. Not intentionally, but because they didn't seem significant at the time. Small comments, subtle dynamics, things that were easy to dismiss individually but added up over time. Those patterns are a lot clearer now. I don't think this situation came out of nowhere. It just took something big to make everything else impossible to ignore. I probably would have reached that point eventually, even without this specific issue, but this accelerated it. There's also been a shift in how I approach my own decisions. Not in a dramatic way, just more awareness of what I'm willing to compromise on and what isn't negotiable. That part feels more grounded than anything else. For now, things are steady. Work is stable. My living situation is comfortable, and there's no ongoing conflict hanging over everything. That's enough. Thank you to everyone who commented and offered perspective. It really helped. My best friend and her husband had a fun time going through them all with me, LOL. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Daily Tales Update.